The hearing room was packed that Tuesday morning, camera crews lining the back wall, reporters elbow to elbow in the press gallery. Governor Ron DeSantis entered exactly 6 minutes late, his signature confident stride carrying him to the witness table with the kind of ease that comes from years of never being seriously challenged. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than most Floridians made in a month, his posture radiating the certainty of a man who had spent the past 2 years building a national brand on the promise of fighting corporate wokeness and winning. His opening statement hadn't even begun, but his eyes were already scanning the committee members with barely concealed dismissal, pausing briefly on Representative Jasmine Crockett before moving on as though she were furniture. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that practiced mixture of folksy charm and executive authority that had made him a national figure. He thanked the committee for the opportunity to discuss Florida's business climate, mentioned his landslide re-election victory twice in the first 90 seconds, and then delivered the line that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Looking directly at Crockett, he smiled the way adults smile at children who've asked an endearingly stupid question. I understand the gentle lady from Texas has some concerns about our handling of corporate relationships in Florida. With all due respect to the representative, these are complex matters of state governance and economic development that require both executive experience and a deep understanding of how enterprise zones and public-private partnerships actually function in practice. I'm happy to explain the basics if that would be helpful. The condescension landed like a slap. Several committee members shifted in their seats. One Republican actually grimaced. DeSantis didn't seem to notice or care. He had already turned his attention to the Republican chairman, ready to pivot to his prepared talking points about Florida's economic miracle and the end of Disney's special privileges. The governor settled into his testimony with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won the room before arriving. He spoke for 11 uninterrupted minutes about how he had stood up to corporate elites, how he had ended Disney's self-governing status after 55 years of what he called special treatment and political manipulation. His voice rose with practiced indignation as he described the betrayal he felt when Disney's CEO publicly opposed Florida's parental rights legislation. He painted himself as the champion of ordinary Floridians against out-of-touch coastal elites who thought they could dictate morality to parents. The numbers he cited were impressive and delivered with precision. Florida's economy had added 400,000 jobs under his leadership. Corporate relocations to the state had increased by 47%. The termination of Disney's Reedy Creek Improvement District had been, in his words, a masterclass in holding corporations accountable to the people rather than the other way around. He mentioned his military service, his time as a federal prosecutor, his understanding of constitutional law. Every 30 seconds or so, he would glance at Crockett to see if she was taking notes, and each time his expression carried the same message: this is over your head, but I'm being patient. When he finally concluded his opening remarks, he leaned back in his chair with the satisfied look of someone who had just delivered a closing argument that left the jury with no choice but acquittal. The chairman thanked him. DeSantis nodded graciously. Somewhere in the third row, a reporter checked her watch. 43 minutes until the next hearing. Plenty of time for the governor to deliver his sound bites and exit victoriously. Jasmine Crockett had sat perfectly still through the entire performance, her expression revealing nothing. She had taken exactly 3 notes on the legal pad in front of her, and anyone watching closely would have noticed that her pen hadn't moved during the governor's economic statistics or his self-congratulatory timeline. When the chairman recognized her for questions, she thanked him with the kind of quiet courtesy that made what came next feel even more devastating. Her first words were not an attack. Governor DeSantis, I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to be here today. I know you're a busy man, and I genuinely do want to understand the details of what happened with the Reedy Creek situation, because I think there's some confusion in the public record that you can help clear up. Her tone was almost apologetic, as though she were the one who needed his help understanding something complex. DeSantis nodded, already preparing his patient explanation. Crockett continued. You mentioned that ending Disney's special district was about accountability and treating corporations the same as everyone else. That's a principle I think most Americans would support. Nobody should get special treatment, right? The governor agreed immediately. Exactly right, Representative. Equal treatment under law. That's what this was about. Crockett nodded slowly, her fingers resting on a blue folder that sat closed in front of her. That makes sense. So just to make sure I understand the timeline correctly, the Reedy Creek Improvement District was dissolved in April 2023. Is that accurate? DeSantis confirmed it was. and the new district, the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, that took its place. You appointed the board members yourself, correct? He acknowledged that Florida law gave the governor appointment authority. And those board members? Crockett said gently. They include Martin Garcia, your former general counsel, and Bridget Ziegler, who was on your transition team, and Brian Aungst, who donated to your campaign. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, Governor. I'm just establishing the facts. Something in DeSantis' expression tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. Those are qualified individuals with relevant expertise, yes. The moment Crockett opened the blue folder felt like a gear shifting. The paper inside was organized with colored tabs, each one marking a separate section, and she handled the documents with the careful precision of someone who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. Her voice didn't change. It remained measured, almost conversational, but there was something harder underneath now, like steel wrapped in velvet. Governor, I want to show you something. This is the final settlement agreement between the state of Florida and the Walt Disney Company, signed on March 27, 2024. You're familiar with this document, I assume? DeSantis said he was generally familiar with the settlement. Crockett turned to a page marked with a yellow tab. Page 14, Section 7, Subsection C. The state of Florida agrees to grant Disney development rights for an additional 2,500 acres of land previously restricted under environmental regulations. The state further agrees to approve expedited permitting for all Disney construction projects within the district for a period of 15 years. And this is the interesting part, Governor. The state agrees to provide infrastructure upgrades to roads, utilities, and transportation systems serving Disney properties at state expense. Estimated value $40 million. She looked up from the document. Does that sound like equal treatment to you? The room had gone very quiet. DeSantis shifted in his chair. Representative, you're taking that out of context. That settlement was necessary to resolve litigation that Disney had initiated, and it actually saved Florida taxpayers money in the long run by avoiding years of costly legal battles. Crockett's expression didn't change. I understand that's your position, Governor. Let me ask you this directly. You just spent 11 minutes telling this committee that you ended Disney's special privileges. But according to this legally binding settlement that your office negotiated and signed, you actually gave Disney more development rights, faster permitting, and $40 million in state-funded infrastructure. So which is it? Did you end their special treatment, or did you negotiate a deal that gave them more benefits than they had before? 10 seconds passed. The only sound in the hearing room was the soft, mechanical click of cameras and the occasional rustle of reporters flipping pages in their notes. 15 seconds. DeSantis' jaw tightened visibly. His hands, which had been casually folded on the table, now gripped the edge with enough force that his knuckles showed white. 20 seconds. Someone in the press gallery coughed, and it sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The governor finally spoke, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Representative, what you're describing is a complex negotiated settlement that involved multiple stakeholders and legal considerations that I don't think you're fully appreciating. Crockett let the deflection hang in the air for a moment before she turned to the next tab in her folder. Let me help you appreciate some additional context then, Governor. This is an internal memo from the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity dated January 12, 2024, 2 months before the settlement. It's marked confidential, but it was released through a public records request filed by the Miami Herald. Would you like me to read the relevant section, or would you prefer to tell the committee yourself what it says? DeSantis' face had gone from composed to guarded. I haven't seen that particular memo, Representative. Crockett's tone remained unchanged. This is from your own economic development director to your chief of staff. I'm quoting directly. Governor wants Disney deal finalized before primary season heats up. Polling shows the ongoing litigation is dragging down his business-friendly credentials with donors. Legal recommends we give Disney most of what they're asking for on development rights and infrastructure. Spin it as a win-win for Florida jobs. Key message. We fought them and won concessions. Don't emphasize what we gave up. End quote. She closed the folder carefully. Governor, you didn't end Disney's special privileges. You gave them a better deal than they had before, and then you lied to Florida voters about what actually happened because you needed a political win before launching your presidential campaign. Is that a fair summary? The room erupted in murmurs. The chairman gavelled for order. DeSantis leaned forward, his voice rising. That is absolutely not accurate. And frankly, Representative, I think you're engaging in the kind of partisan distortion that the American people are sick of. What we did in Florida was hold a corporation accountable. Crockett didn't raise her voice. Governor, I just read you your own director's words. Your own staff called it a political spin strategy. Those aren't my words. Those are your people's words. The governor tried a different approach, his tone shifting to wounded reasonableness. You're cherry-picking internal communications. Every negotiation involves give and take. The important thing is that we changed the fundamental relationship between Disney and the state. Crockett opened a second folder, this one red. Let's talk about that fundamental relationship. This is the original Reedy Creek Charter from 1967. Under the old system, Disney paid for its own infrastructure, its own fire department, its own emergency services. They were functionally self-governing, which you've said many times was inappropriate. Under your new settlement, who pays for road improvements to Disney property? DeSantis hesitated. That would depend on the specific project. Crockett's voice remained patient. Let me be more specific. Who's paying for the $40 million in highway expansion on I-4 near Disney Springs? Because according to the Florida Department of Transportation budget I have right here, that's coming from state transportation funds. That's taxpayer money, Governor. Under the old Reedy Creek system, Disney would have paid for that themselves. You gave them a $40 million gift and called it accountability. The governor's voice took on an edge. You're distorting the facts, Representative. That highway expansion serves the entire region, not just Disney. Crockett nodded slowly. Does it serve the 12,000 residents of Celebration, Florida, who still don't have the road repairs they've been asking for since Hurricane Ian? Because I have petitions here from community members begging the state for $3 million to fix their damaged infrastructure, and they've been told there's no money in the budget. But somehow we found $40 million for roads that just happen to lead directly to Disney's newest development project. The pattern was emerging now, and anyone watching could see where this was heading. Every defense the governor offered was met with another document, another specific dollar amount, another named victim of his priorities. Crockett opened a third folder, green this time, and the papers inside were dense with highlighted sections. Let's talk about what you said regarding economic development. You mentioned 400,000 jobs created under your administration. That's an impressive number. Let me ask you, how many of those jobs were created by the Disney settlement specifically? DeSantis tried to redirect. The settlement was part of a broader economic strategy. Crockett didn't let him finish. I'm asking about specific jobs, Governor. Disney claimed in their press release that the development rights you gave them would create 17,000 new jobs over 10 years. Do you know how many jobs have actually been created in the 14 months since the settlement? The governor said he didn't have those figures in front of him. 230, Crockett said, according to Florida's own employment data. 230 part-time positions, mostly in food service and retail. Average wage $14 an hour. Meanwhile, Disney used those expanded development rights to build a luxury housing development where the cheapest unit starts at $850,000. That's what $40 million in taxpayer infrastructure bought us, Governor. 230 low-wage jobs and luxury condos that working Floridians can't afford. She pulled out another document. And speaking of working Floridians, I want to read you something. This is from a woman named Maria Gonzalez. She worked as a housekeeper at a Disney resort for 19 years. She was laid off 3 months after your settlement was finalized, along with 487 other longtime Disney employees. Disney claimed it was necessary restructuring, but those layoffs happened right after you gave them 15 years of guaranteed expedited permitting, which means they can now hire contract workers instead of permanent employees and cycle through cheaper labor without the permitting delays that used to make long-term employees more cost-effective. Crockett looked directly at DeSantis. Did anyone in your office ask Disney to protect existing workers as part of the settlement? Or were you so focused on getting your political win before the primaries that you forgot about the actual people whose jobs were on the line? The governor's face had gone from guarded to flushed. Sweat was becoming visible at his hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning. His voice rose. Representative, you're trying to turn a complex economic negotiation into some kind of personal scandal, and it's not going to work. What we did in Florida was in the best interest of the state. Crockett's tone remained absolutely level. Governor, let me ask you something very simple. Before you signed this settlement, before you gave Disney $40 million in infrastructure, expanded development rights, and 15 years of expedited permits, did you disclose to the public that your campaign had received contributions from Disney executives totaling over $300,000? The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This wasn't the silence of a difficult question. This was the silence of a trap closing. DeSantis stared at her. That is completely irrelevant, and you know it. Campaign contributions are a public record and fully legal. Crockett opened yet another folder. They are public record. You're right about that. This is the Florida Division of Elections database. I've highlighted every contribution from anyone listed as employed by Disney or its subsidiaries to your gubernatorial and presidential campaigns. It totals $317,000 between January 2022 and March 2024. That's the exact period when you went from calling Disney a woke corporation that needed to be held accountable to negotiating a settlement that gave them everything they wanted. She let that sit for a moment. Governor, I'm not saying contributions influenced your decision. I'm asking you to explain to the people of Florida why they should believe you fought Disney when Disney executives were writing your campaign checks the entire time you were supposedly fighting them. 5 seconds. 10, 15. The governor's hands were trembling slightly now. He started to speak, stopped, started again. The timing of legal contributions has nothing to do with policy decisions. His voice cracked slightly on the word policy. These are separate matters entirely, and this committee knows it. Crockett's expression was something colder than anger, something more dangerous. Let me read you one more thing, Governor, and then I'll let you respond. This is from the settlement agreement, page 27, the section your office insisted remain confidential until the Herald's attorneys forced its release last month. The parties agree that all terms of this settlement, including but not limited to development rights transfers, infrastructure commitments, and expedited permitting provisions, shall remain confidential and not subject to public disclosure for a period of 5 years from the date of execution. You signed a deal that gave Disney $40 million in taxpayer money and development rights worth potentially hundreds of millions more. You took $300,000 in campaign contributions from Disney executives, and then you tried to hide the details from Florida voters for 5 years. She leaned forward slightly. Governor, I have a simple yes or no question for you. Did you lie to Florida voters when you said you held Disney accountable? The room was absolutely silent. Every camera was locked on DeSantis. The governor's face had gone from flushed to pale. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He reached for his water glass and his hand shook enough that water sloshed slightly. He set it down without drinking. 10 seconds. 15. 20. A reporter in the back row later said you could hear her digital recorder's hard drive spinning in the quiet. 25 seconds. DeSantis's chief of staff, sitting 3 rows behind him, made a subtle gesture toward the exit. The governor didn't seem to see it. 30 seconds. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was barely above a whisper. I resent the implication of this line of questioning. It wasn't an answer. Everyone in the room knew it wasn't an answer. Crockett knew it. The cameras knew it. Most importantly, DeSantis knew it. What happened next unfolded with a strange kind of inevitability, like watching a building collapse in slow motion once the support beams have failed. The governor tried to pivot to talking points about Florida's overall economic growth, but his voice had lost its authority. Crockett simply waited for him to finish and then asked if he was ready to answer the yes or no question. He called her questioning inappropriate. She asked the court reporter to read the question back. He said the premise was flawed. She asked if he was refusing to answer whether he had lied to voters. His voice rose. I have been completely transparent about the Disney situation. We fought them, we won concessions, and Florida is better for it. Crockett opened her first folder again, back to the memo from his economic development director. Governor, your own staff wrote that the key message was to claim you won concessions while not emphasizing what you gave up. That's the definition of political spin. That's not transparency. That's deception. DeSantis stood up. It was a shocking break in protocol. Committee witnesses don't simply stand and leave. But he was already reaching for his jacket. I don't have to sit here and be accused of corruption by someone who clearly came in here with a political agenda rather than any interest in the truth. His voice was shaking now, the careful control completely gone. This is exactly the kind of partisan circus that makes Americans lose faith in Congress. Crockett remained seated, her expression unchanged. Governor, you're under subpoena. You can't just leave. DeSantis was already walking toward the door, his chief of staff scrambling to follow. Watch me, he said, and his voice cracked on both words. The hearing room exploded into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. The chairman gavelled frantically for order. Camera operators rushed to track DeSantis' exit. But through all of it, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still at the committee table, her folders arranged neatly in front of her, her jacket without a single wrinkle. She waited for the room to quiet, which took nearly 3 minutes. When the noise finally subsided enough for her to be heard, she spoke directly into her microphone, and her words would be clipped and shared millions of times over the next 72 hours. Let the record show that Governor DeSantis was asked a direct question about whether he lied to Florida voters regarding the Disney settlement. He was presented with his own staff's internal communications describing the arrangement as political spin. He was shown evidence of campaign contributions from Disney executives during the exact period he was negotiating the settlement. He was confronted with the $40 million cost to taxpayers and the failure to protect workers. And rather than answer a simple yes or no question, he fled this hearing. She paused, looking directly at the camera. The people of Florida deserve better than a governor who sells them out to corporate donors and then runs away when asked to explain himself. This isn't about partisan politics. This is about accountability. And the fact that Governor DeSantis couldn't sit here and defend his own deal tells you everything you need to know about whether that deal served the people of Florida or served his presidential ambitions. In the hallway outside, DeSantis was already surrounded by reporters, his communications team trying to create space as he pushed toward the exit. Someone shouted a question about the campaign contributions. Someone else asked if he would return to answer Crockett's questions. The governor kept walking, his face set in a rigid mask that couldn't quite hide the panic underneath. By the time he reached his car, the first clips were already going viral. The 30-second silence. The memo from his own staff. The moment he stood and walked out. Within 6 hours, DeSantis fled would be trending on every major platform. Within 24 hours, 3 major donors would publicly distance themselves from his presidential campaign. Within a week, Florida newspapers would be calling for a full investigation into the Disney settlement. But in that moment, in the hearing room, Jasmine Crockett simply gathered her folders with the same careful precision she had used throughout the hearing, thanked the chairman for his time, and prepared for her next appointment. Her jacket remained perfectly smooth. Her expression remained composed. And somewhere in Florida, Maria Gonzalez, the housekeeper who had lost her job after 19 years, watched the hearing on her phone and cried. The final record of the proceeding would note that Governor Ron DeSantis appeared before the House Committee on Oversight and Reform for 43 minutes before departing without completing his testimony. It would note Representative Jasmine Crockett's questions regarding the Disney settlement, the campaign contributions, and the infrastructure expenditures. It would note the governor's refusal to provide a direct answer to whether he had been truthful with voters. What it wouldn't capture was the feeling in the room when he stood to leave, the collective understanding that something had fundamentally broken in his carefully constructed narrative. Crockett had asked about qualifications at the beginning of the hearing, back when DeSantis thought he was educating an inexperienced congresswoman on the complexities of state governance. But as it turned out, she wasn't the one who needed the education. She had done her homework. She had the receipts. She had the patience to let him build his defense before systematically dismantling it with his own words, his own staff's communications, his own signature on a settlement that betrayed everything he claimed to stand for. DeSantis had questioned her qualifications because she was a young black woman from Texas who couldn't possibly understand executive governance. What he failed to understand was that qualifications aren't measured by titles or tenure. They're measured by preparation, precision, and the courage to ask the questions that powerful men desperately want to avoid answering. On that count, Representative Crockett was the most qualified person in the room, and Governor DeSantis, for all his executive experience and constitutional law expertise and military service and political ambitions, had just proved that he was fundamentally unqualified to answer for his own actions. The empty chair he left behind said more than any testimony could have. And Jasmine Crockett, her folders closed, her work complete, didn't need to say another word.